"You're only good for dishes," she yelled. I laughed. A week later, she begged for forgiveness. From the outside, everything seemed fine. After my husband passed, there weren't many options. The house felt cavernous without him. The stairs became more than just stairs. The nights were longer, heavier. So when Matthew and Haley offered the guest house behind their Colorado home, I said yes. "It'll be good for the kids," Haley said when we stood under the lilacs near the mailbox. "You'll be part of everything." It was painted the same soft gray as the main house. A tidy place. Small porch, a cozy stove, windows that overlooked the garden Haley never had time to tend. I hung lace curtains in the kitchen and put my tea tins in a neat row on the shelf above the sink. It wasn't home, not really, but it was quiet. I helped where I could. Picked up the children when school let out early. Cooked dinner twice a week, nothing fancy. Chicken stew. Zucchini bread. I vacuumed the stairs without being asked, folded the towels left on the dryer. Haley would glance up from her laptop and say, "Thanks," with that small, efficient smile of hers. Matthew would kiss the top of my head now and then, distracted. It all worked, on paper. But sometimes, during dinner, I'd speak, share a memory, a thought, and Haley's eyes would shift toward me. Not quite impatient. Just measuring. Like she was checking whether I still fit into their rhythm. Once, I returned from the laundry room and found her folding a basket of clothes I hadn't asked her to touch. She held up a pair of my socks. "You like staying busy, right?" she said, smiling. "This'll give you something to do." It was light. Playful, maybe. But something in the way she said it made the air colder. I took the socks. Smoothed the hem. Didn't say anything. There was no reason to be concerned. Not yet. Only a small shift. A quiet tension, like a hairline crack across a porcelain plate. Something you notice only when the light hits just right. The first time Haley corrected my cooking, she did it with a laugh. "Don't use so much garlic," she said, lifting the lid of my casserole. "The kids hate it." I nodded, though I knew they had eaten it fine the week before. I'd seen Olivia mop her plate with a corner of bread, and Mason had asked for seconds. Still, I stirred in silence, letting the steam cloud my glasses. That night, I used less seasoning. The dish tasted bland, but no one said anything. Another time, I crocheted a small blanket for Mason's reading corner. His school had asked each student to bring something comforting for quiet time. I used a soft green yarn with navy trim, his favorite colors. Haley thanked me with a quick smile, then the next day, replaced it with a fleece throw that still had its Amazon tag. "I just wanted something more neutral," she said. "But thank you for the effort." Effort. A word that fell like dust. When her sister visited from Portland, I was introduced not as Matthew's mom, but as the lady who helps us with the house. I laughed quietly, as if it were a joke I didn't quite catch. They moved on before I could find the words to correct her. The calendar on the fridge, once dotted with my name under activities like pick up, Olivia, or dinner, grandma's lasagna, started appearing fully filled in. Appointments, school events, weekends away. No notes, no questions. "Oh, hope you don't mind watching the kids again," Haley said once, grabbing her coat. "We've booked a weekend getaway. Just 2 nights." Her tone made it sound like it had already been arranged. Matthew was upstairs when she said it. He came down a few minutes later and kissed my cheek on the way out the door. "You're the best, Mom," he said, like a man signing off an email. That weekend, Olivia had a fever. I sat beside her bed through the night, refreshing the cool cloth on her forehead, reading her the old fairy tales she still pretended to be too old for. When Haley returned, she didn't ask how the night had gone. Just said, "Oh, she's still sniffling," and walked past me into the kitchen. There were other moments, too small to mention yet impossible to forget. A birthday dinner I wasn't invited to, just couples, you wouldn't have liked the noise. A family photo taken for their holiday card, printed and framed before I even knew it happened. A batch of cookies I baked and left on the counter, still there 3 days later, untouched. Matthew began skipping our evening chats. We used to sit on the porch after the kids went to bed, he with a glass of wine, me with tea. He would talk about work, about stress, about nothing. Then one evening, he didn't show. I waited, tea cooling in my hand. Finally, I stood and walked back to the guest house. The next day, he said he'd fallen asleep watching a show with Haley. It became a pattern. My contributions became expected. My absence unnoticed. My presence tolerated. Once, I suggested we all go apple picking, the orchard just an hour's drive. Haley smiled, her eyes already on her phone. Oh, that sounds sweet. Maybe you could take the kids one afternoon while we catch up on errands? Not all at once. Not enough to call it unkindness. But slowly, the edges frayed. The children, too, began to reflect what they saw. Olivia stopped saying thank you. Mason tossed his shoes on the guesthouse porch without removing the mud. They began to treat my presence as infrastructure, like the oven or the car, always there, expected to function without praise. One evening, as I cleared plates from the table, Mason called from the living room, "Where's the helper?" as he looked for a snack. Matthew laughed. Haley didn't correct him. I stood in the kitchen, holding a dish still warm from the roast, the faint outline of gravy pooling in the grooves. Something quiet in me folded that day. It wasn't a loud moment. No slammed doors. No harsh words. Just a soft, cold realization. I wasn't family anymore. I was support staff. That night, I sat in the guesthouse alone, the light over the sink the only one I left on. I looked out at the dark outline of their house, its windows glowing golden, flickering with laughter I was no longer invited into. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just sat, one hand resting on the worn arm of the chair, the other clutching a tea mug that had long since gone cold. And somewhere deep inside me, something whispered. You don't belong here. Not anymore. The tablecloth had snowflakes embroidered at the corners. I'd ironed it that morning, soft steam rising as I pressed each crease flat, careful not to let the corners curl. The kids were playing a game in the living room, plastic tokens clattering across the hardwood floor. I had cinnamon simmering on the stove, and a bowl of clementines set out, just the way Matthew used to like when he was small. Christmas was days away. I had volunteered to help with the napkins, folding them into the little pouches that could hold cutlery and a sprig of rosemary. Haley had printed out a schedule. She liked to plan everything, and that was fine. I liked lists. I liked order. But when she came into the kitchen that afternoon, phone in one hand and a stack of printed pages in the other, something about her stride was different. Sharper. She placed the papers on the counter beside the napkins and tapped the top one. I've finalized the dinner schedule, she said, not looking at me. You'll do dishes again this year. It's kind of your thing. She didn't laugh. Didn't soften the words. Just kept scrolling through her phone. I looked up. I thought I might. She interrupted without looking. You're only good for dishes, right? It was the kind of sentence that should have been followed by a laugh. A wink. Some gesture of lightness. But none came. I stood there, my hand half folding a napkin, the cloth limp between my fingers. She didn't pause. Just kept walking. Out of the kitchen, down the hallway. I heard her call out something to Mason about the holiday playlist. The door shut behind her. I turned back to the counter. There were still 14 napkins left to fold. But I didn't move. The kettle clicked off on the stove. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of Christmas music drifting in from the other room. My finger stayed on the napkin. My eyes on the countertop. My mind somewhere else. It wasn't the insult. Not really. It was what came with it, the assumption. The certainty that I would not object. That I would stay in my place, smile, and fold more napkins. Something in me let go. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just a soft release, like a hand opening after holding too tightly for too long. I laid the napkin down gently. Smoothed it flat with my palm. Then turned off the stove, wiped the counter once, and left the rest untouched. In the guest house, I packed a bag. 2 sweaters. A book. My reading glasses. The flannel nightgown with the tiny blue roses I'd had since before Matthew graduated college. I didn't need much. I moved slowly, deliberately. The act of packing didn't feel rebellious. It felt necessary. Like brushing your teeth before bed. Like locking the door when the wind rises. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a text. I slid the bag into the back seat of the old car they never used anymore, the one Matthew said I could keep just for errands. And I drove. The roads were dry. Snow piled neatly on the sides, salted tracks marking paths from earlier travelers. I passed a diner with fogged-up windows. A gas station with Christmas lights strung over the pumps. I didn't feel afraid. The cabin lodge sat just north of the parkway, nothing fancy. 24 cottages, each with a wood-burning stove and a view of the lake, now frozen under a sheen of pale ice. I hadn't been there since James was alive. We used to come in winter, back when Matthew was young. We'd rent the same cottage, drink cocoa by the fire, listen to the lake crackle in the night air. I checked in under my own name. No questions asked. Inside the cottage, everything smelled like cedar and thyme. The heat creaked on. The windows looked out onto the stillness of the trees. I sat in the armchair near the fire, folded my hands over my lap, and listened. No footsteps above me. No calendar stuck to the fridge. No voices calling from other rooms. Just quiet. I slept deeply that night for the first time in months. No dreams. No alarms. Just the soft weight of a blanket pulled up to my chin and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. The next morning, I woke with the light. Made tea. Sat by the window and watched the snow fall in soft, lazy flurries. 3 days passed like that. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder what they were thinking. I watched the sun rise through bare pine branches, drank peppermint tea from a chipped mug, and walked the lake's frozen edge in thick boots that crunched with each step. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger, not the kind I expected. Just something like gravity, pulling me back to myself. Back to the part of me that once believed I had a place, and then learned that sometimes places close around you like fists. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was medicinal. On the 3rd night, I stood outside the cabin, my breath fogging the air. I looked up at the dark sky. There were stars. Thousands of them. And not a single one asked me to wash a dish. That was the moment I knew. I would not go back. The guesthouse key was still in my coat pocket. I turned it over in my hand once, then placed it gently beneath the stone planter on their porch, the same planter where Haley hid spare keys for the dog walker. No note. No announcement. I didn't need words. I'd spoken enough in the folds of laundry and the corners of every meal. Back at the cabin, I unpacked slowly. Hung my coat near the door. Lined up my slippers beneath the bed. The motions were familiar, comforting. I didn't need to say out loud that I wasn't returning. The decision had already rooted itself, quiet and solid. I'd thought absence might feel like loss. Instead, it felt like rest. I made oatmeal in the mornings. Read a novel by the window in the afternoons. Stitched the edge of an old hand towel I found in the closet. At night, I wrapped myself in James's cardigan, the one I'd folded away and almost forgotten. It still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The phone rang twice the first evening. Once from Matthew. Once from Haley. I let them ring. It wasn't to punish them. I simply didn't have answers they deserved to hear yet. The cabin had no television. Just a radio that picked up soft classical music from a nearby town. I left it on low volume, a gentle hum between chapters of my book and sips of tea. Sometimes I caught myself listening for children's voices. Olivia's laugh. Mason's stomp. But the silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was simply different. On the second morning, I ventured into town. A small place, 2 cafes, a hardware store, and a post office with a faded blue awning. I bought eggs and milk. A cinnamon roll for no reason at all. The woman at the counter asked if I was visiting. I said yes. She smiled and said, "Take your time. This town moves slow." I liked that. No pressure to explain. That evening, I walked to the lake again. The ice had hardened, pale blue beneath the fading light. A fox had left small tracks across the edge. I followed them until they vanished into the trees. I thought of Matthew then. A boy with mud-caked shoes and scraped knees, running through autumn leaves. I remembered him tugging my hand at the zoo, asking for one more look at the otters. He hadn't meant to become this distant man. Not deliberately. That's the trick of time. It doesn't tear, just erodes. And if you're not careful, you find yourself holding the memory of someone who no longer exists. I stopped walking. Let the cold bite the edge of my nose. Breathed in the silence like a tonic. By the 4th day, I was no longer checking my phone at all. I tucked it into the drawer beside the bed. The act felt like folding away a version of myself I no longer needed, one who waited for calls that never came, who smiled through being passed over. I wasn't hiding. I was untethering. Each evening, I wrote a few lines in a notepad I'd brought. Not letters. Just fragments. A line of poetry. A scent remembered. A thought about a dress I'd once sewn by hand. Haley used to say I lived in the past. I see now what she meant. But the past had been kind to me. It had loved me, more faithfully than the present ever did. And sometimes, it's not regression to return to the things that held you gently. It's survival. I made no proclamations. I simply existed. Each day a soft refusal. Each meal eaten in silence, a quiet declaration. Each walk, a reclaiming of ground beneath me. And in that stillness, I found not loneliness, but proof. Proof that I was enough, even when no one needed me. On the morning of the 5th day, I woke to snow resting lightly on the window pane. Just a dusting, enough to soften the world into silence. I boiled water for tea. Sat by the window. And for the first time since leaving, I opened my phone. 12 missed calls. 6 from Matthew. 3 from Haley. The rest from unknown numbers, likely friends or neighbors wondering where I'd gone. I scrolled without urgency. No voicemails. Just the raw need implied in the frequency. Then I opened the messages. Where are you? Are you okay? Please call. Haley's worried sick. A different tone from Haley. I don't know what game you're playing. You scared the kids. At least call to apologize. I read them twice. Not because I was unsure of their meaning, but because I wanted to be sure of mine. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the break in routine. About the machine of their life no longer humming smoothly in the background. I had been the silent motor beneath the floorboards. Now they could hear the silence. And they didn't like it. I closed the phone. Set it back on the table. Later that morning, I called a lawyer. His name was Thomas Wright, quiet man, careful voice. He'd handled the estate of an old friend of ours years ago. I remembered his office smelled of dust and peppermint. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Rains," he said, recognizing my voice after a pause. "It's been some time." "I need to move some things," I said simply. "Of course. What sort of things?" I told him about the cottage. A property left to me by a distant cousin who had no children and little desire for anything but solitude. I'd ignored the inheritance at the time, too tethered to Matthew, too convinced I needed to remain close. "It's yours outright," Thomas confirmed after a few minutes of checking. "You just never claimed the title." "I'd like to now." I could hear him adjust in his seat. "That can be arranged." The papers were emailed that afternoon. I printed them at the library in town, 2 pages, clear and unassuming. The cottage sat on a quiet inlet in Maine, overlooked by pine and owned by no one but time itself. I signed. Scanned. Sent them back. Then I made one final call, to my pension office. The voice on the other end was chipper. "Yes, of course we can redirect those deposits. Do you have the new banking information?" I gave her the new account number, one I'd opened quietly at the town bank that week. She read it back to me. "Anything else I can assist you with today?" "No. That's everything." It was all so quiet. No bang. No fireworks. Just ink on paper, numbers on a screen. But something irreversible had begun. That evening, I stepped outside as the light faded and left the guesthouse key under the stone planter. It felt strange to hold it again, even for a moment. The key that had once meant proximity, safety, belonging. Now it just felt like a paperweight for someone else's comfort. Back in the cabin, I poured myself a small glass of red wine. Sat near the fire. I thought of James. How he used to slice oranges with a small paring knife and offer them to me without a word. Love, quiet as a gesture. He would have liked this place. I posted one photo to my old account, rare, for me. Just a picture of snow boots by the cabin door, a steaming mug in my gloved hand, the trees behind me heavy with white. No face. No tags. Just a caption. "Starting over isn't brave. It's necessary." I turned the phone off again after that. That night, sleep came easily. No dreams. Just the soft assurance of having made a decision without permission. The messages came quickly after the photo. Not comments, those remained few, mostly distant acquaintances liking the image without thought. It was the private messages that arrived in waves. "Matthew first. Where are you? We're worried." Another, an hour later. "Are you okay?" And then, "Haley's worried sick. Please call." Haley's voice joined next, colder, clipped. "You scared the kids. Whatever you're trying to prove, it's childish. Just tell us you're safe, at least." There was no apology. No acknowledgement of the words that sent me packing. Just a rattling of the cage they thought I still occupied. As if concern could mask control. I read every word. Let them sit in my chest like smooth stones. And then I did nothing. They had expected tears. Maybe anger. But not this. Not absence. Not silence. I imagined Haley pacing the kitchen, looking out toward the empty guesthouse. I imagined Matthew pulling into the driveway late at night, hoping to see a light on. They'd grown accustomed to me bending, apologizing, accepting. Now, without me, the floor creaked differently. I received a message from Olivia. Just one. It said, "Grandma?" And it broke something quiet in me. I didn't respond, not because she didn't deserve one, but because children always carry the weight of adult decisions. I wouldn't drag her into it. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the lodge. The handwriting was Matthew's, tight, uneven, familiar from birthday cards and school permission slips decades ago. Inside, a note on cream-colored paper. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I didn't mean for things to go this way. Please let me know where you are. Please come back." He had underlined please. But there was no mention of Haley. No mention of the comment. Of the years of quiet dismissal. It was a letter about discomfort, not understanding. I folded it neatly. Placed it back in the envelope. Set it in the drawer beside the bed. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. The next day, the cottage in Maine became mine officially. Thomas sent the confirmation, title deed, property map, transfer letter. It felt abstract, reading words like irrevocable and sole ownership. But when I saw my name, typed in bold, something settled. That evening, I packed again. Not out of urgency, but direction. At sunrise, I checked out of the lodge, left a quiet thank you on the nightstand for the cleaning staff, and drove north. No music. Just the road. Trees. Light. Colorado faded behind me, town by town. I passed states like chapters. Slept in small roadside inns. Ate oatmeal with brown sugar at diner counters where no one asked questions. Every now and then, I'd glance at my phone. The notifications piled up. Matthew. Haley. A few from her mother. One from a family friend asking gently if I was well. I didn't answer any. Not because they weren't kind. But because I had no explanation to offer that wouldn't sound like blame. And I wasn't here to blame. I was here to start over. When I arrived in Maine, the lake was still frozen, but soft at the edges. A cabin with green shutters stood among a hush of pines. The door creaked when I opened it, the kind of sound that feels like a welcome. Inside, dust. A kettle. A stack of firewood. A silence that didn't press, it cradled. I placed my suitcase near the wall, opened a window, and let the cold air inside. Later that evening, I lit a fire. Sat on the floor with a map. Traced my finger along the lake's curve. The cottage had no internet. No cable. No reminders of what I'd left behind. Just wood. Wind. Water. That night, I made soup. A simple broth, thick with potatoes and thyme. I ate slowly, watching the flames. I had no need to explain where I'd gone. Because for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I was. He pulled into the driveway just before noon. The crunch of tires over gravel was the only sound in the quiet. I had been sitting on the porch, blanket over my knees, a half-read book resting on my lap. The sunlight filtered through the pines, dappling the old wooden steps. Matthew stepped out slowly, shielding his eyes from the light. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still carrying that slight forward stoop he'd had since college. He looked thinner. Or maybe just tired. "Mom," he said. I didn't move from the chair. Just watched as he made his way toward me, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his coat. "I've been trying to find you for days." I nodded once. "You found me." He stood at the bottom of the steps, uncertain. "May I come up?" I gestured to the chair opposite me. It creaked under his weight. There was silence for a while. Just the breeze in the trees and the distant creak of the dock shifting with the lake's slow thaw. "I brought you something," he said at last. From his coat, he pulled a thermos. "Coffee. Like you used to make for me after soccer practice." He set it on the small table between us. I didn't reach for it. "I just want to talk," he added. I folded the corner of my book page, set it aside. "All right." He looked at me then, really looked. I saw in his face a flicker of the boy he had been. The boy who cried when he couldn't tie his shoes. The boy who brought me dandelions in crumpled fists. But the man before me was someone else. Older. Shaped by choices I hadn't seen. "Haley didn't mean it like that," he said softly. I looked at him, unmoving. "She meant it enough to say it." He shifted in his seat. I should have stopped her. "I know that." I waited. "I just want things back the way they were." I exhaled through my nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sigh. "They never worked for me," I said. That stopped him. His mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak. He hadn't expected that. He had come with a plan, maybe even a speech. He hadn't come prepared for the refusal. He looked out at the trees. "She says you overreacted. That you misunderstood." I picked up the thermos. Unscrewed the lid. Poured a small amount into the tin cup, just enough to warm my hands. I didn't drink. And you? I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. I think we got comfortable. With you just being there. I nodded. Convenience is not affection. He closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. The words were soft. Sincere, perhaps. But incomplete. I'm not angry, I said. But I'm done. He blinked, slowly. Like he hadn't expected the door to close that easily. This place, he gestured toward the trees, the lake, the porch. You really want to live out here? Alone? I smiled then. Not wide. Not sharp. Just still. I've never felt more at home. He leaned forward. The kids miss you. Olivia asks about you every night. My chest tightened at that. But I didn't let it show. I love them. That hasn't changed. Then come back, he said. Even just for a little while. For the holidays. I shook my head. If I come back, nothing changes. I return to the same unspoken rules. The same quiet erasure. He opened his mouth again, but I stopped him with a raised hand. You didn't notice, Matthew. That's the part that stays with me. He sat back, as if something inside him had deflated. I thought you were okay, he said. I was quiet, I corrected. There's a difference. The wind picked up then, rattling the bare branches. Somewhere nearby, a bird chirped once and went silent again. He stood. Slowly. Uncertain. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I nodded once. You don't have to. He looked down at the thermos, still half full. Then back at me. Do you need anything? He asked, a final offering. No, I said gently. I have everything I need. He looked like he wanted to say more. But instead, he just stepped down from the porch. Walked back toward his car. The door shut. The engine started. Gravel crunched once more beneath the tires. And then he was gone. The trees stood still again. The porch was quiet. I poured the coffee back into the thermos. Set it beside my chair. Picked up my book. The wind moved softly around me. The door hadn't slammed when he left. But it stayed closed. The days moved slowly, in the best sense of the word. I began waking without an alarm, just the pale light of morning slipping between the wooden slats of the blinds. I'd make tea, slice a pear, and sit by the window as the lake shifted from gray to blue. No lists. No errands. No one waiting on me to pick up a roast or fix a loose hem. For the first time in years, I lived inside a day that belonged only to me. The cottage didn't need much. I swept the floors in silence. Lit the stove when the air turned. I began writing again, just little things. A recipe I remembered from my mother's kitchen. A line of poetry I liked. A description of how the snow glittered at dusk. The stillness wasn't a void. It was space. I found myself drawn to small routines. On Thursdays, I baked scones, not the ones Haley used to like, full of chia and almond flour, but the ones I remembered from James's mother, buttery, flaky, with a whisper of lemon. On Saturdays, I walked the lakeshore path. It curved behind the trees and opened up into a clearing where the wind was always stronger, colder. I brought a thermos of tea, sat on the smooth boulder near the edge, and watched the light shift across the water. The quiet no longer asked anything of me. It simply received me. There was a general store about 10 minutes away, tucked between a closed antique shop and a faded barber's pole. The man who ran it, George, always nodded without asking questions. Once, he asked if I'd retired from something important. Just motherhood, I said. He smiled. That's a full career. At home, I hung string lights across the kitchen window. Not for anyone else, just because the warm glow in the early dark felt comforting. I pinned a photo of Olivia and Mason to the fridge, one of the few I had kept. They were both mid-laugh, caught in some joke I couldn't hear. I didn't cry when I looked at it. I only felt distance. Not bitter, not cruel. Just honest. Some days, I would sit outside with a blanket and a radio tuned to a low crackling station, the kind that played old waltzes and the occasional local news. I began to recognize the cadence of the weather announcer's voice. It became a kind of companion. In the evenings, I sometimes reread old letters. The ones James had written to me when we were first married, before cell phones, before emails, before life got loud. They were quiet letters, filled with small observations and kind assurances. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed being spoken to like that, with care, and without purpose. I found an old camera in one of the drawers. Not digital. Film. I bought a roll in town and began taking photographs, mostly trees, the curve of the frozen lake, my own hands resting on a teacup. No one would see them. That was the point. Each day here did not need to be earned. It simply arrived. I had no dinner parties to prepare for. No errands sprung upon me last minute. No half-hearted thank yous tossed over shoulders. Just the crackle of firewood. The soft sound of snow falling against the porch railing. The clink of a spoon in a ceramic bowl. One afternoon, I found an old deck of cards in the drawer beside the fireplace. I played solitaire at the table, just like my mother used to do on long winter days. The game didn't matter. The slowness did. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't recovering. I was living. The hands that once trembled when I stirred sugar into tea, fearful of saying too much, staying too long, needing too little, no longer shook. They moved with purpose. With steadiness. And not once during those days did I wonder what Haley was doing. Or whether Matthew had noticed the quiet. The messages had stopped. The silence between us had settled into something permanent. No longer a pause, an ending. I was not bitter. I was clear. There was nothing dramatic about the life I now led. No proclamations. No awakenings. Just quiet. And truth. And the smallest, softest kind of freedom. It was spring when the letter arrived. The lake had begun to thaw at the edges, shedding its winter skin. The path to the clearing had turned soft with mud, and small yellow shoots pushed through the earth behind the cottage. I'd hung the laundry on the line that morning and watched it sway in the light breeze, a row of cotton shirts dancing slowly against the pine trees. The envelope sat tucked beneath the welcome mat, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Haley's. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and left it there while I boiled water. I didn't rush. I swept the porch, folded a towel, rinsed my cup. It sat quietly, patient and sealed. Finally, I sat down, opened it with the blunt side of a butter knife, and unfolded the single sheet inside. There was no greeting. No preamble. Just this. I miss your presence. The kids do too. I wasn't fair to you. Please consider coming back, even just for a visit. No signature. No details. No apology, not fully. Just a small doorway. Opened barely enough to see light through. I read it once, then again. There were no accusations. No excuses. That was something. But there was no reckoning either. I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer with Matthew's earlier note. 2 letters, both unsure of what they were asking. Not quite invitations. Not quite regrets. Just attempts. I didn't respond. I didn't feel anger. There was no heat in my chest. No tightness in my throat. Just a deep, steady stillness. Because I was no longer the woman who needed acknowledgement to know she mattered. The silence that followed the letter was not empty. It was enough. That week, I repaired the hem on a quilt that had begun to unravel. I wrote 3 postcards to old friends, nothing about where I was, just stories about the crocuses and the lake's soft light at dusk. I baked an orange tea cake and left half of it on George's counter at the store. I received no more messages. No calls. Not even Olivia's little voice asking when I'd come back. Perhaps they'd all grown quiet. Or perhaps they had accepted what I already knew. I wasn't returning. I walked one afternoon to the far side of the lake, where the birch trees grew thinner and the path widened. I sat on the old dock, feet dangling over the edge, and let the wind press lightly against my back. From here, the world felt distant. Not cold. Just honest. I thought then, not of Matthew or Haley or what had passed, but of James. How he used to trace circles on my hand when I worried. How he once said, "Not everything that disappears is a loss." I'd written that line in my notebook the week before, without realizing it was his. The birds had returned by then, small, fast things that darted between the branches. I watched them for a while. Watched the ripples on the water. The early blooms by the base of the hill. The quiet had not grown thinner. It had grown deeper. One night, a car pulled up the road. It paused for a while near the bend, lights dimmed, engine running low. I watched from the window, the kettle still whistling behind me. Eventually, the car backed up, turned around, and disappeared into the trees. No one knocked. No one left a note. And I did not ask why they came. Instead, I turned the kettle off, poured my tea, and lit a small candle on the sill. Because this life, the one I'd stepped into quietly, without announcement, was no longer a pause. It was mine. Each letter, each visit, each whisper of "maybe come back" floated past like driftwood on the lake. And I had no desire to collect what no longer held me. The morning sun reached across the floorboards like an invitation. I sat at the table, the last of the tea cooling beside me, the same cup I'd used every day since arriving. The journal lay open, pages filled with uneven handwriting, reflections, small recipes, fragments of remembered dreams. I ran my fingers across the edge of the paper, feeling the soft drag of ink already dried. I hadn't written in a week. Not out of neglect. Simply because some days, words weren't needed. The silence was enough. But today, I picked up the pen. There had been no new letters. No knocks at the door. No calls. And I had not checked the phone in days. I wrote slowly, letting the sound of birds and breeze accompany each line. No explanations. No defense. Just the truth I'd come to carry without effort. I didn't disappear, I wrote. I just stepped out of the role you gave me. I paused. Let that sentence sit on the page like a stone in water. I didn't write more. I didn't need to. There were still photos in my drawer, of Olivia in a Halloween costume, of Mason with cake on his nose, of Matthew as a baby, asleep on my chest. I didn't hide them. But I no longer sought them out. I had stopped counting the days since I left. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd arrived. Outside, the lake had gone still again. Not frozen, not wild. Just calm. I pulled on my boots, buttoned my sweater, and stepped into the air. The light hit the tops of the trees first, turning them golden. The path to the dock was soft beneath my feet. I walked slowly. Not because I was tired. Because I had time. At the water's edge, I sat on the old bench. The one James used to prefer. I watched the mist lift, strand by strand, until the far bank came into view. I didn't think about who might come looking again. Or what stories they might tell in my absence. I thought only of how the tea tasted when sipped slowly, how the pine needles felt underfoot, how quiet had become not something to fill, but something to trust. The door they once closed behind me, I'd built no new one in its place. Just windows. Just air. Just space enough to breathe again. And that was all I ever needed.